History of the World by J. M. Roberts, Book 4, The Age of Diverging Traditions, Chapter 9, Worlds Apart. The Spaniards were, only in the most formal sense, the destroyers of Maya civilization. It had already collapsed from within by the time they arrived. Explanation is not easy given our information, and it is tempting to fall back on metaphor. Maya civilization was the answer to a huge challenge and could meet it for a time, but only with a precarious political structure vulnerable to outside interference and at the cost of narrow specialization and burdens which were huge in relation to the resources available to support them. Even before foreign invasion, as political fragmentation occurred, the irrigation arrangements of which the archaeologists have discovered the remains were falling into destitute and decay. As decisively as elsewhere in the Americas, the native culture left behind no living style, no technology of note, no literature, no political or religious institution of significance. Only in the language of the Maya, peasantry did the past retain some foothold. What the Maya left behind were wondrous ruins, which would long bemuse and fascinate those who had later to try to explain them. While Maya society was in its final decay, one of the last peoples to arrive in the Valley of Mexico won a hegemony there, which amazed the Spanish more than anything they later found in Yucatan. These were the Aztecs who had entered the valley in about 1350 AD, overthrowing the Toltecs, who then exercised supremacy there. They settled in two villages on marshy land at the edge of Lake Texcoco. One of these was called Tenochtitlan, and it was to be the capital of an Aztec empire, which expanded in less than 2 centuries to cover the whole of central Mexico. Aztec expeditions went far south to what was later the Republic of Panama, but showed no diligence in settlement. The Aztecs were warriors and preferred an empire of tribute. Their army gave them the obedience of some 30 or so minor tribes or states, which they left more or less alone, provided the agreed tribute was forthcoming. The gods of these peoples were given the complement of inclusion in the Aztec pantheon. The center of the Aztec civilization was Tenochtitlan, the capital they had built up from the village. It stood in the lake Texcoco on a group of islands connected to the lake shores by causeways, one of which was 5 miles long and took 8 horsemen abreast. The Spanish left excited descriptions of this city. Its magnificence, said once, exceeded that of Rome or Constantinople. It probably contained about 100,000 inhabitants at the beginning of the 16th century, and to its maintenance went what was received from the subject peoples. By comparison with European cities, it was an astonishing place, filled with temples and dominated by huge artificial pyramids. Yet, its magnificence seems to have been derivative, for the Aztecs exploited the skills of their subjects. Not a single important invention or innovation of Mexican culture can confidently be assigned to the post Toltec period. The Aztecs controlled, developed, and exploited the civilization that they found. When the Spanish arrived in the early 16th century, the Aztec Empire was still expanding. Not all of its subject peoples were completely subdued, but Aztec rule ran from coast to coast. At its head was a semi divine but elected ruler chosen from a royal family. He directed a highly ordered and centralized society, making heavy demands on its members for compulsory labor and military service, but also providing them with an annual subsistence. It was a civilization pictographically literate, highly skilled in agriculture and the handling of gold, but knowing nothing of the plough, ironworking, or the wheel. Its central rituals, which greatly shocked the Spaniards, included human sacrifice. No less than 20,000 victims were killed at the dedication of the Great Pyramid of Tenochtitlan. Such holocausts reenacted a cosmic drama which was the heart of Aztec mythology. It taught that the gods had been obliged to sacrifice themselves to give the sun the blood it needed as food. This religion struck Europeans by its revolting details, the tearing out of victims' heart, the flaying and ceremonial decapitations, but its bizarre and horrific accompaniments were less significant than its profound political and social implications. The importance of sacrifice meant that a continual flow of victims was needed, as these were usually supplied by prisoners of wars, and because death in battle was also a route to the paradise of the sun for the warrior. A state of peace in the Aztec Empire would have been disastrous from a religious point of view. Hence, the Aztecs did not really mind that their dependencies were only loosely controlled and that revolts were frequent. Subject tribes were allowed to keep their own rulers and governments so that punitive raids could be made upon them at the slightest excuse. This ensured that the empire could not win the loyalty of the subject peoples. They were bound to welcome the Aztec collapse when it came. Religion was also to affect in other ways the capacity to respond to the threat from Europeans, notably the Aztecs' desire to take prisoners for sacrifice rather than to kill their enemies in battle, and in their belief that one day their great god, Quetzalcoatl, white skinned and bearded, would return from the east where he had gone after instructing his peoples in the arts. Altogether, for all its aesthetic impressiveness and formidable social efficiency, the feel of Aztec civilization is harsh, brutal, and unattractive. Few civilizations of which we know much have pressed so far their demands on their members. It seems to have lived always in a state of tension, a pessimistic civilization, its people uneasily aware that collapse was more than a possibility. To the south of Mexico and Yucatan lay several other cultures distinct enough to their degree of civilization, but none of them was so remarkable as the most distant, the Andean civilization of Peru. The Mexican peoples still lived for the most part in the Stone Age. The Andeans had got much further than this. They had also created a true state. If the Maya excelled among the American cultures in the elaborate calculations of their calendar, the Andeans were far ahead of their neighbors in the complexity of their government. The imagination of the Spaniards was captured by Peru even more than by Mexico, and the reason was not simply its immense and obvious wealth in precious metals, but its apparently just, efficient, and highly complex social system. Some Europeans soon found accounts of it attractive, for it required an almost total subordination of the individual to the collective. This was a society ruled by the Incas. In the 12th century, a people from Cuzco began to extend its control over earlier centers of civilization in Peru. Like the Aztecs, they began as neighbors of those longer civilized than themselves. They were barbarians who soon took over the skills and fruits of higher cultures. At the end of the 15th century, the Incas ruled a realm extending from Ecuador to central Chile, their conquest of the coastal areas being the most recent. This was an astonishing feat of government, for it had to contend with the natural obstacles provided by the Andes. The Inca's state was held together by about 10,000 miles of roads passable in all weathers by chains of runners who bore messages either orally or recorded in Quapu, a code of knots in colored codes. With this device, elaborate records were kept. Though preliterate, the Andean Empire was formidably totalitarian in the organization of its subjects' life. The Incas became the ruling caste of the empire. its head becoming Sapa Inca, the only Inca. His rule was a despotism based on the control of labor. The population was organized in units, of which the smallest was that of 10 heads of families. From these units, labor service and produce were exacted. Careful and tight control kept population where it was needed. Removal or marriage outside the local community were not allowed. All produce was state property. In this way, agriculturalists fed herdsmen and craftsmen and received textiles in exchange. There was no commerce. Mining for precious metals and copper resulted in an exquisite adornment of Cusco, which amazed the Spaniards when they came to it. Tensions inside this system were not dealt with merely by force, but by the resettlement of loyal populations in a disaffected area and a strict control of the educational system in order to inculcate the notables of conquered peoples with the proper attitudes. Like the Aztecs, the Incas organized and exploited the achievements of culture which they found already to hand, though less brutally. Their aim was integration rather than obliteration, and they tolerated the cults of conquered peoples. Their own god was the sun. The absence of literacy makes it hard to penetrate the mind of this civilization, but it is notable that, though in a different way, the Peruvians seem to have shared the Aztecs' preoccupation with death. Accidents of climate, as in Egypt, favored its expression in rites of mummification. The dry air of the high Andes was as good a preservative as the sand of the desert. Beyond this, it is not easy to say what divisions among the conquered peoples persisted and were expressed in the survival of tribal cults. When a challenge appeared from Europe, it became apparent that Inca's rule had not eliminated discontent among its subjects for all its remarkable success. All the American civilizations were, in important and obvious ways, very different from those of Asia or Europe. At present, it still seems that complete literacy escaped them, though the Incas had good enough bureaucratic processes to run complex governmental structures, and the Maya kept elaborate historical records. Their technologies, though they had certain skills at a high level, were not so developed as those already known elsewhere. Though these civilizations provided satisfactory settings and institutions for cultures of intense but limited power, the contribution of the indigenous Americans to the world's future was not to be made through them. Therefore, it had in fact already been made before they appeared, through the obscure, unrecorded discoveries of primitive cultivators who had first discovered how to exploit the ancestors of tomatoes, maize, potatoes, and squash. In so doing, they had unwittingly made a huge addition to the resources of mankind and were to change economies around the world. The glittering civilizations built on that in the Americas, though, were fated in the end to be no more than beautiful curiosities in the margin of the world history, ultimately without progeny. Chapter 10, Europe, the First Revolution. Few terms have such misleading connotations as the Middle Ages, a wholly Eurocentric usage, meaning nothing in the history of the other traditions. The phrase embodies the negative idea that no interest attaches to certain centuries except for their position in time. They were first singled out and labeled by men in the 15th and 16th centuries, seeking to recapture a classical antiquity long cut off from them. In that remote past, they thought men had done and made great things, a sense of rebirth and quickening of civilization upon them. They could believe that in their own day, great things were being done once more. But in between two periods of creativity, they saw only a void. Find just by falling in between other ages, and in itself dull, uninteresting, barbaric. Then they invented the Middle Ages. It was not long before people could see a little more than this in 1,000 or so years of European history. One way in which they gained perspective was by looking for the origins of what they knew. 17th century Englishmen talked about a Norman yoke, supposedly laid on their ancestors, and 18th century Frenchmen idealized their aristocracy by attributing its origin to Frankish conquest. Such reflections, nonetheless, were very selective. In so far as the Middle Ages were thought of as a whole, it was still, even 200 years ago, often with mild contempt. Then, quite suddenly, came a great change. Men started to idealize those lost centuries as vigorously as their forebears had ignored them. Europeans began to fill out their picture of the past with historical novels about chivalry and their countryside, with mock baronial castles inhabited by cotton spinners and stockbrokers. More important, a huge effort of scholarship was then brought to bear on the records of these times, still continues. In its earlier phases, it encouraged some romanticized and over-enthusiastic responses from them. Men came to idealize the unity of medieval Christian civilization and the seeming stability of its life, but in so doing blurred the huge variety within it. Consequently, it is still very hard to be sure we understand the European Middle Ages. One crude distinction in this great tract of time, nevertheless, seems obvious enough. The centuries between the end of antiquity and the year 1000 or so now look very much like an age of foundation. Certain great markers then laid out the patterns of the future, though change was slow and its staying power still uncertain. Then, in the 11th century, a change of pace can be sensed. New developments quickened and became discernible. It becomes clear as time passes that they are opening the way to something quite different. An age of adventure and revolution is beginning in Europe, and it will go on until European history merges with the first age of global history. This makes it hard to say when the Middle Ages end. In many parts of Europe, they were still going strong at the end of the 18th century, the moment at which Europe's first independent offshoot had just come into existence across the Atlantic. Even in the new United States, there were many people who, like millions of Europeans, were still gripped by a supernatural view of life and traditional religious views about it, much as medieval men and women had been 500 years earlier. Many Europeans then lived lives which, in their material dimensions, were still those of their medieval forerunners. Yet, at that moment, in many places in the Middle Ages, were long over in any important sense. Old institutions had gone or were crumbling, taking unquestioned traditions of authority with them. Here and there, something we can recognize as the life of the modern world was already going on. This became first possible, then likely, and finally unavoidable in what can now be seen as Europe's second major formative phase and the first of her revolutionary eras. The Church. The Church is a good place to begin. By the Church, as an earthly institution, Christians mean the whole body of the faithful, lay and cleric alike. In this sense, in Catholic Europe, the Church came to be the same thing as society during the Middle Ages. By 1500, only a few Jews, visitors, and slaves stood apart from the huge body of people who, at least formally, shared Christian beliefs. Europe was Christian. Explicit paganism had disappeared from the map between the Atlantic coasts of Spain and the eastern boundaries of Poland. This was a great qualitative as well as a quantitative change. The religious beliefs of Christians were the deepest spring of a whole civilization, which had matured for hundreds of years and was not yet threatened seriously by division or at all by alternative mythologies. Christianity had come to define Europe's purpose and to give its life a transcendent goal. It was also the reason why a few Europeans first became conscious of themselves as members of a particular society, Christendom. Nowadays, non Christians are likely to think of something else as the church. People use the word to describe ecclesiastical institutions, the formal structures and organizations which maintain the life of worship and discipline of the believer. In this sense, too, the church had come a long way by 1500. Whatever qualifications and ambiguities hung about it, its successes were huge, if also its failures were great too. There were within the church plenty of men who confidently insisted on the church's power and duty to put them right. The Roman Church and the likes, which had been a backwater of ecclesiastical life in late antiquity, was, long before the fall of Constantinople, the possessor and focus of unprecedented power and influence. It had not only acquired new independence and importance, but also had given a new temper to the Christian life since the 11th century. Christianity then had become both more disciplined and more aggressive. It had also become more rigid. Many doctrinal and liturgical practices dominant until this century are less than 1,000 years old. This set up, that is to say, when more than half the Christian era was already over. The most important changes took roughly from 1000 to 1250, and they constituted a revolution. Their beginnings lay in the Cluniac movement. Four of the first 8 abbots of Cluny were later canonized. 7 of them were outstanding men. They advised popes, acted as legates, served emperors as ambassadors. They were men of culture, often of noble birth, sprung from the greatest families of Burgundy and the West Franks, a fact which helped to widen Cluny's influence. And they threw their weight behind the moral and spiritual reform of the church. Leo IX, the Pope with whom papal reform really begins, eagerly promoted Cluniac ideas. He spent barely 6 months of his 5 years pontificate at Rome, moving about instead from synod to synod in France and Germany, correcting local practice, checking interference with the church by lay magnates, punishing clerical impropriety, imposing a new pattern of ecclesiastical discipline. Greater standardization of practice within the church was one of the first results. It began to look more homogeneous. Another outcome was the founding of a second great monastic order, the Cistercian, by monks dissatisfied with Cluny and anxious to return to their original strictness of the Benedictine rule, in particular by resuming the practical and manual labor Cluny had abandoned. A Cistercian monk, Saint Bernard, was to be the greatest leader and preacher of both Christian reform and crusade in the 12th century, and his order had widespread influence both on monastic discipline and upon ecclesiastical architecture. It too pushed the church towards greater uniformity and regularity. The success of reform was also shown in fervor and moral exaltation of the crusading movement, often a genuinely popular manifestation of religion. But new ways also aroused opposition, some of it among churchmen themselves. Bishops did not always like papal interference in their affairs, and parochial clergy did not always see a need to change inherited practices which their flock accepted. Clerical marriage, for example. The most spectacular opposition to ecclesiastical reform came in the great quarrel which had gone down in history as the investiture contest. The attention given to it has been perhaps slightly disproportionate, and some would say misleading. The central episodes lasted only half a century or so, and the issue was by no means clear cut. The very distinction of church and state, implicit in some aspects of the quarrel, was in anything like the modern sense still unthinkable to medieval man. The specific administrative and legal practices at issue were, by and large, quite soon the subject of agreement, and many clergy felt more loyalty to their lay rulers than to the Roman Pope. Much of what was at stake, too, was very material. What was in dispute was the sharing of power and wealth within the ruling classes who supplied the personnel of both royal and ecclesiastical government in Germany and Italy, the lands of the Holy Roman Empire. Yet other countries were touched by similar quarrels. The French in the late 11th century, the English in the early 12th, because there was a transcendent question of principle at stake, which did not go away. What was the proper relationship of lay and ecclesiastical authority? The most public battle of the investiture struggle was fought just after the election of Pope Gregory VII in 1073. Hildebrand, Gregory's name before his election, hence the adjective Hildebrandine, is sometimes used of his policies and times, was a far from attractive person, but a pope of great personal and moral courage. He had been one of Leo IX's advisers and fought all his life for the independence and dominance of papacy within Western Christendom. He was an Italian, but not a Roman. And this perhaps explains why, before he was himself Pope, he played a prominent part in the transfer of papal elections to the College of Cardinals and the exclusion from it of the Roman lay nobility. When reform became a matter of politics and law rather than morals and manners, Hildebrand was likely to provoke rather than avoid conflict. He was a lover of decisive action without too nice a regard for possible consequences. Perhaps strife was already inevitable. At the core of the reform lay the ideal of an independent church. It could only perform its task, thought Leo and his followers, if free from lay interference. The church should stand apart from the state, and the clergy should live lives different from laymen's lives. They should be a distinct society within Christendom. From this ideal came the attacks on simony, the buying of preferment, the campaign against the marriage of priests, and a fierce struggle over the exercise of hitherto uncontested lay interference in appointment and promotion. This last gave its name to the long quarrel over lay investiture, who rightly appointed to a vacant bishopric the temporal ruler or the church. The right was symbolized in the act of giving his ring and staff to the new bishop when he was invested with his see. Further potential for trouble lay in more mundane issues. Perhaps the emperors were bound to find themselves in conflict with the papacy sooner or later, once it ceased to be in need of them against other enemies, for they inherited big, if shadowy claims of authority from the past which they could hardly abandon without a struggle. In Germany, the Carolingian tradition had subordinated the church to a royal protection, which easily blurred into domination. Furthermore, within Italy, the empire had allies, clients, and interests to defend. Since the 10th century, both the emperor's practical control of the papacy and their formal authority had declined. The new way of electing popes left the emperor with a theoretical veto and no more. The working relationship, too, had deteriorated in that some popes had already begun to dabble in troubled waters by seeking support among the emperor's vassals.